I'm starting this video with the press announcement from Condé Nast, so you all know that the publication I'm reading is meant to highlight the voices of the LGBTQ community and is not a partisan site biased against trans folk. I want to start this video by saying total respect for the trans community and their rights, and I think everybody has a right to live peacefully and in harmony regardless of their race, gender, identity, etc. Violence is never acceptable, and I hope that is clear to everybody who watches this video. Because now we're going to get into some of the complications having to do with social justice and identity politics. And this is stemming from a website, them.us. So there may be some criticism for them.us or for the research that I'm about to cite, but I want to just mention that on October 14, 2017, Condé Nast announced the launch of Them, a next-generation community platform, chronicles and celebrates the stories, people, and voices that are emerging and inspiring all of us, ranging in topics from pop culture and style to politics and news, all through the lens of today's LGBTQ community. Just want to make that clear that I'm not pulling up a source that opposes any of these people, and it's really important because I think this gives us a fair chance to look at what's going on with some of the identity politics, these issues. Because this story that I have, new research shows a vast majority of cis people won't date trans people. And I think this is a really important thing to look at, especially in light of a lot of what's been going on with pride marches, the lesbian community. It says a recent study attempts to quantify the extent of trans discrimination when it comes to romantic and sexual relationships. I was actually really fascinated by this article, and I think assuming it's correct. So there's a reason why I use biased sources in a lot of these videos, and the reason is, I read Vox specifically to look at how they view the world and then, talk about it. If there's something that could be critical of the left, I try to find a left-wing source so that it can't be viewed as being, biased against them if it's on their side. In this instance, I think this is absolutely fair. The story starts, considering the discrimination trans people face on a daily basis, it comes as no surprise that trans people are overlooked when it comes to dating. Two Canadian researchers recently asked almost 1,000 cisgender folks if they would date a trans person in a new study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships. This is the first study to ever attempt to quantify the extent of trans discrimination when it comes to romantic and sexual relationships. 958 participants, all but 7 cisgender, ranging in age from 18 to 81, with an average age of 26, were asked to indicate which genders they would consider dating. The options included cisgender man, cisgender woman, trans man, trans woman, or genderqueer, and participants could select as many genders as they wanted. So I want to stop right here and point out that this is potentially already transphobic, okay? And I'm not trying to be disrespectful. This is not meant to be facetious. New York recognizes 31 genders. There are many different jurisdictions that recognize a multitude of genders. And it's important to point out that this study only gave a few options, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options out of a potential, at least in New York City, 31. So I think it's fair to say that already this study is biased if it's trying to actually communicate with trans folk or with cis people when dealing with issues of transgender. And the reason I think it's important is that when you're trying to get an understanding of what cis people, people who identify as their biological sex, then they need to be given every option. Because if they're going to try and, break down, for instance, genderqueer, trans women, trans man, and cis do not encompass all of the perceived genders, especially with New York City. There's, like I said, 31. In which case, someone in the study might say they're not going to pick trans or queer, but they would have picked a non-binary choice were they presented with it, okay? So from the lens of what we have in law, I think it's important to point out that this is potentially flawed, though this is taking place in Canada. I also recognize that with the multitude of genders that the law in some places recognize, this makes it very difficult to get an accurate study done. But anyway, let's carry on. I don't want to waste your time. Only 12% of participants selected trans woman or trans man. Okay, so what this is saying is that of the people, the 958, that's around 100 or so people who said they were willing to date trans people, right? Those who would consider dating a trans person didn't differ in race, ethnicity, but were somewhat older, more likely to hold a university degree, and unsurprisingly, less likely to be religious than those who would not date a trans person. But some of the most striking differences were in regards to participants' gender and sexual orientation. Virtually all heterosexuals excluded trans folks from their dating pool. only 1.8% of straight women and 3.3% of straight men chose a trans person of either binary gender. But most non-heterosexuals weren't down for dating a trans person either, okay? With only 11.5% of gay men and 29% of lesbians being trans-inclusive in their dating preferences. Bisexual, queer, non-binary participants, these were all combined into one group, were most open to having a trans partner, but even among them, almost half did not select either trans man or trans woman. What's really fascinating about the study, basically what they're saying is that, for the most part, people who identify as straight do not want to date trans people, and even among the non-heterosexual community, only a small percentage, less than a third for lesbians and around 10% for gay men, which is surprising. It would seem that transgendered individuals face significant discrimination when it comes to dating. But the most fascinating, maybe not necessarily fascinating, but interesting and very important, was that in the study they found that those who were trans-inclusive, it wasn't gender, it was sex, right? So I'll read through it, but basically my understanding is that a gay man who is willing to date a trans person would date a trans woman, meaning someone who is born biologically male, meaning they had a sexual preference, not a gender preference. And this is really interesting when we look at a lot of the rhetoric coming out with that happened at the Pride Parade, for instance. In London, lesbians marched in front of the parade, and they said something to the effect that trans activism erases choice. Many of these lesbians are arguing that trans activism is arguing for conversion therapy. One of the arguments is that if you are attracted to women, you should be attracted to any women regardless of their biological sex. Because trans women are women, if you're attracted to women, then you should be attracted to trans women as well. But what this study found is that that gender is much less important than biological sex. They say, surprisingly, among the 127 participants open to dating a trans person, almost half selected a trans person of a gender incongruent with their stated sexual orientation. For example, 50% of trans-inclusive straight women and 28% of trans-inclusive gay men were willing to date a trans woman. Okay, so I want to break this down. It can be a little confusing. Basically, straight women prefer male genitals, and they were willing to date a trans woman, someone with male genitals who transitions to woman, meaning biological sex is a bigger factor in dating in this, at least this study found, than gender was. They say, even though one wouldn't expect either straight women or gay men to be attracted to women. Similarly, 50% of trans-inclusive straight men and 69% of trans-inclusive lesbians said they'd date a trans man, even though both groups are presumably only attracted to women. And 33% of the trans-inclusive bisexual queer participants said they would only date a trans person of one gender but not the other, even though one may expect this group to be attracted to multiple genders. This is actually a really important study for a few reasons. For a long time, there have been people who have argued for conversion therapy and said that people who are gay, bisexual, or lesbians could be converted into being attracted to a particular sex. And many people on the left have argued that's not the case. Now, what we're seeing with trans activism is that it's not about sex, but it's about gender. And that's what we saw. There's a lot of controversy going on, particularly within the lesbian community, because there have been trans women lesbians. This is a person who was born biologically male, transitioned to a woman, and wants to date other women. The controversy here is that some of these people retain male genitalia, and lesbians have stated, some of them, that they don't want to be with people who are biologically male or born biologically male. This study finds that is overwhelmingly the case, that regardless of what someone's gender is, how they outwardly identify themselves, people prefer biological sex over perceived gender. I gotta say, it's particularly fascinating. And this is a really important study because of the controversy that's going on. So I'll just read a little bit more of this, and I think I'll wrap things up. I want to make sure that everybody watching recognizes, I'm trying to be as sensitive as possible. It may not be possible. I think these are really important issues going on in our society for a few reasons. Laws are being passed that recognize this. I have a lot of friends who are non-binary and genderqueer, and I mean no disrespect. We talk regularly. I feel that people are worthy of respect no matter what kind of life they live or how they identify. Violence is never acceptable or anything like that. But there's a lot of questions I have about how this is going to work in society. And I hope that people recognize when I bring these issues up, it's not meant to be disrespectful, but I'm genuinely trying to understand how we can sort through these issues. For instance, in New York City with 31 genders, what a lot of restaurants have started doing is offering non-binary restrooms or multi-gender or all-gender. And I mean this seriously. There are some people who refuse to identify with gender. They say that they are agender, non-gender. And then so one of the questions I have, and I'm open to anybody who wants to give me a legitimate answer, because I genuinely don't understand. I can make assumptions. I don't want to do that. If a restaurant opens up with 2 bathrooms and they're all gender, is that acceptable for non-gender individuals? Especially when the symbol they show will be an image of a male figure and a female figure. Is that acceptable? I don't know if that's acceptable in New York law, because I believe they do recognize agender, people who exist without it. They say they have no gender. Then all gender, I don't know if that would include people who don't have it. I mean this sincerely. I'm genuinely trying to understand how these rules will work in law. And when I saw this story, it was actually really fascinating because, I don't want to be disrespectful to any communities, be it the lesbian community or the trans community. And when I see this conflict happening and these stories emerging from, London, I really want to understand how we can find a way to live together respectfully with all groups. So seeing a study like this that says that people prefer biological sex over gender, for the most part, not absolutely, for the most part, it's actually really interesting. And I think this is an important step in better understanding this. So I want to take a look at their final thoughts from them, not us. They say, the high rates of trans exclusion and potential dating pools are undoubtedly due in part to cis-normativity, cis-sexism, and transphobia, all of which lead to lack of knowledge about transgender people and their bodies, discomfort with these unknowns, and a fear of being discriminated against by proxy of one's romantic partner. I'm going to say I kind of disagree with that for one reason. If, somebody is a gay man or a lesbian woman and they do deal with these things, but they're choosing to be with someone of the biological sex they prefer, people would see them. If a gay man was with a passing trans woman, then people would view that as normal. I don't think they would face as tough an issue. And I have to wonder that if someone is dating the incongruent gender, meaning like a lesbian woman with a trans man, then that doesn't carry the same stigma as a same-sex relationship. I would imagine. I could be wrong. But, discomforts of being discriminated against by proxy of one's romantic partner it's really hard to quantify. Honestly, I'm fascinated by the study. I think it's great that they did it. But they say it is also possible that at least some of the trans exclusion is due to the fact that for some people, sexual orientation might not just be about a partner's gender identity, but attraction to specific body types and or judgment of reproductive capabilities. I think that's really important, and I think this needs to be brought up in talking about trans issues. Of course, this is just one study and a non-representative sample. Participants were recruited using online advertisements, listserv messages, on-campus announcements, in-print magazine ads, snowballing methods, I don't know what that is, and invitations sent to previous study participants. So more research is needed to understand the extent of this form of trans exclusion and the reason driving it. But despite the limitations, these results clearly indicate that although the visibility of transgender people is on the rise, we still have a long way to go to reach trans equality. And I would agree with that last part of the statement. And I would say that regardless of what you think about the gender issue, regardless of what you think about the trans community, there are a lot of people who I think are just kind of mean and nasty. And I think all people are deserving of respect. And I think we can have respectful conversations to understand one another regardless of how people function. However you want to live, from the most extreme to the most typical, I suppose. The important thing is that we understand the rules. And what I mean by that is how we can function peacefully without everything falling apart. This is one step in that direction. I hope this was informative to all of you who watched, and I hope people are willing to listen without, plugging their ears and, going la 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 la, because there's a lot of stuff that we have to learn if we're going to navigate society. You don't have a right over someone else's rights, right? Our rights exist. You can't cause harm to other people, and you can't take away other people's rights. So we'll see how this shapes out. But thanks for watching, and I got another video coming up in just a few minutes, so I'll see you then.